Nice to be here with all of you. We are going to start our workshop now. We are here today to discuss enhanced learning, innovations and approaches to using case studies in the public administration classroom. I'm Stephanie Dallimore. I'm going to be your moderator today. I work at Gallaudet University in the MPA program there. Just so everyone knows, this event is scheduled for about 2 hours. We're going to go till 3:15 today. So I'm looking forward to being with you for an extended period of time. We're very lucky that we get to do this workshop together. And we have an amazing group of panelists here who are going to share their wisdom. And then we're going to have an opportunity for you to learn more in breakout rooms about different case study possibilities. So I want to start by letting you all know that this workshop is being convened by the American Society for Public Administration section on public administration education, the SPAE section in ASPA. And SPAE is the organization that is the group within ASPA that organizes the Teaching Public Administration Conference every year. And this year we are being virtually co-located with NASPA, and we're really excited. While we wish we could all be together in person, we are in a time where we have to do things virtually due to the coronavirus and other travel restrictions, but we are going to make the most of this time together. And I'm just thrilled that we have people here from all over the world today, and what a unique opportunity we have to work together on enhancing our classrooms. So if you want to learn more about SPAE and this section within ASPA, I'm going to put our website here in the chat box. I'll be using the chat box today to share different links or copies of the questions that we'll be asking. So keep a lookout there for more information. If you have questions for us, I'll be monitoring the chat box as best as I can in a couple different hats I'll be wearing today, but I look forward to your questions in the chat box as well. So I also want to say that all of us in this group are big fans of social media. So if you feel so inclined to share about your experience today during our workshop or afterwards, I hope you can follow along on social media. Here's some relevant information in the chat box about how you can tag our event using different hashtags. The ASPA SPAE section is here with our handle on Twitter and some hashtags that we use on social media. So let's get started talking about this workshop. Thank you for being here. Right now, I'm sharing my screen with a welcome slide. In a couple minutes, I'll turn this off and I'll turn it over to the panelists. But right now, I want to talk about what are we going to be doing today. And we have two parts to this discussion today. We are going to start with a roundtable discussion with our panelists, followed by a Q&A with our audience. And so I ask you to put your questions into the chat box, and I will present those to the audience at the end of our question period with the panelists. And then after that, we're going to break out into different rooms. You'll get to choose the different breakout rooms on 3 different topic areas. I'm going to put the names of those breakout rooms in the chat box for you to see. And you'll get to choose to visit one of those breakout rooms to learn with 2 of the panelists more details about these different topics of case studies that we can use in the classroom. So we're going to have a breakout room on film and contemporary events. We'll have a breakout room on using published case studies from peer-reviewed academic journals. And then we'll have a breakout room on how do you develop your own case study using information in current events or in maybe your local newspaper. How do you translate that into use in the classroom? Okay, so I'm going to stop screen sharing. And I am also going to ask if you're a participant in this panel, if you could turn off your video. I'm going to have the panelists turn on their videos and join me on the screen here. Thank you, panelists, for being here today. So we have with us today Dr. Lori Brainerd, an associate professor at George Washington University. We have Del Beharith with an assistant professor at Savannah State University. We have Dr. Sean McCandless, an assistant professor at the University of Illinois Springfield. We have Dr. Patricia Mitchell, an assistant professor at Appalachia State University, and Dr. Ashley Nichols, an associate professor at Kent State University. Thank you all for being here today and for joining us. I'm just thrilled to have you all here. And again, if you're a participant in the panel for the roundtable, if you could turn your cameras off, that will allow the audience to focus on the panelists while they have their discussion. And then during the Q&A, we can turn our videos on in the audience too. Thank you so much. So before I ask the first question of our panelists, I would love for the audience to answer a question for all of us. So if you were in Pathable to the NASPA conference website, before you clicked on the button to enter this meeting, we had, there's a couple different tabs, and one of those tabs says polls. And I would love for everyone in our workshop to go ahead and answer the 3 polling questions so we can get a better sense of how you currently use case studies and what kind of case studies you incorporate in the classroom. So if you haven't done so, go back into Pathable and click on the polling button for this session. And we have 3 questions. You can click on the vote button and you can enter your responses there. I'm going to give us 1 minute to do that, and then we'll take a look at the results. So I appreciate all of you answering these polling questions. I am keeping an eye on the polls here. I see some people are still voting, so I'm gonna give us 1 more minute to look at these polling questions before I share them with all of you. This is really exciting to see it happening in real time. So let me just give it about 30 more seconds. And let me go ahead and share the results of what I'm seeing in the polling questions so we can all know who is in our workshop today. Okay, so the first polling question we have was, in the courses you teach, how many of those classes incorporate case studies? And it looks like most of the people, 60% here, voted saying that they use it in some of their classes, and maybe not all of their classes, but in some of their classes. So that's a great start. That makes a lot of sense why you're here today. The second polling question was, do you find case studies, or where do you find case studies for use in the classroom? And we definitely have a variety of different places where people go. It looks like most people rely on a website that might be dedicated primarily for teaching case studies, but we have case study textbooks as another popular option too, with some diversity in there and more people still voting, so that's great. And the last polling question we have here is, what do you look for in a case study? And overwhelmingly, it looks like people look for something that fits in the course topic, and that makes a lot of sense, right? We wouldn't just use just anything in the classroom. We want something that makes sense and fits. And then also we use case studies, it looks like in this group, that are designed for use in the classroom, and maybe that they have teaching resources. So this is great. Thank you all for answering this poll, and you can continue to vote on that. Well, I would love to hear from the panelists now about your reflections on these results, but I'm going to go ahead and pose the first question to all of you, and I'm going to copy it into the chat box as well. So we know that there's a variety of different media that can be used to develop case studies. There's also a variety of topics that can be taught using case studies. So I'm curious, can you give one example of a case that you used, that you taught using case studies? What type of cases do you use, and what medium do you use to present the case studies? And anyone is welcome to answer that question first, however and whenever you feel moved.
Stephanie, I'll start. In my background, I've got about 15 years experience working in local and state government, both as a local and a state economic developer for a number of years, 2 of those years as a county manager. And while I do pull on published case studies, one of the courses I teach is economic development in our MPA program. And I use storytelling, and I pull cases from actual happenings from news articles. And when I bring the story into the classroom based on my personal experience or another developer's experience, or when I use a news article, I go into the classroom with a framework already determined on what I want the class to pull out of that case study. So while I tell them the story or I give them the news article to read, as we're discussing it, I have a framework in mind about what they will pull from it to learn about public administration principles.
I'll go ahead and go next. Or Del, please, sorry.
Go ahead, Sean, you spoke first.
You sure? Okay. Okay, so I largely teach organizational dynamics and HR and social equity and the ethics class that we have at the University of Illinois Springfield. And I think case studies are great for all of those courses, you know, especially the organizational dynamics and HR classes, because case studies to me can allow us to have a problem focus in the class, such as, you know, what is it about organizational dynamics that when are they not working that cause these issues within organizations that then lead to problems of agency performance, which then lead to agencies not being able to fulfill their mandates to provide, you know, efficient, effective, economical, and equitable services. And case studies I found are integral to diagnose really how these issues come about. Now, I use a textbook to complement this. You know, I use Bowman and Deal's Reframing Organizations. They have these wonderful frames about the structural frame and the HR frame, political frame, and symbolic frame. And having case studies that match that about, well, here are different ways in which structure can be involved, and here's a case about it. Here are different ways in which HR and so forth. And so what I'm going to do in the chat is I'm going to share 3 case studies that I use, and in the interest of transparency, one of them is mine, and I'm also JPay's case study editor, so we can talk a little bit more about publishing cases in JPay. It's a great repository. So this first one is one that I wrote about administrative decision making. Co-wrote with Nicole Elias and Rashmi Chordia about Confederate statue removal in Baltimore, and this can get into a lot of different aspects, but organizational dynamics, intro classes, and so forth. The second one is one I use a little bit more. Horseplayer sexual harassment, and it's in the Department of Corrections, and that's a really very interesting case in JPay that's useful for organizational dynamics and HR. It can be analyzed from a lot of different perspectives. And finally, how to write a case study for public affairs by Hatcher, McDonald, and of course Brainerd, who is here with us right now. A great example of if you do want to write a case study, not only for JPay, but just in other ways, what are some good elements to consider? So that's my long answer to that question.
Okay, and I can go real quick. So I use a lot of film. I also use, you know, like published articles. I use the newspaper articles, but I really tend to focus on film in the classroom. And I teach a lot of HR, a lot of nonprofit. And for me, in HR classes, it's I use Parks and Rec, which Bori wrote 2 pieces on in public integrity and Journal of Public Affairs and Education. So those are really 2 good articles that looks at ethics within Parks and Rec. So I take that and I use that to teach human resources. And I'll show a clip and we'll discuss it. So like when we think about, and this is going to be a little bit of a spoiler in case anybody has not seen all of Parks and Rec, but at the end, Ron Swanson, you know, is given a job pretty much by Leslie Knope. And when we think about, you know, how we actually hire people and what's the process, that was kind of like a patronage system. Oh, I think you'd be, perfect for this job. And, you know, so it didn't go through the entire process. So we talk about like, what's the ethics, you know, what is the HR process of that. So, you know, and it's really interesting because like students and especially our MPA students, I think that they love to watch Parks and Rec because they see what they're doing in there. And I remember I feel a little bit negative about using Parks and Rec because it's like, oh, there's an ethical issue here, there's an ethical issue here. How does this go with human resources? What type of leadership styles? And I remember once a student came back and he did his end of term paper on the Traeger effect. And he countered all the points that I used throughout the semester with the ethics of Parks and Rec with the Traeger effect and how Chris Traeger was actually good public administration and good HR resources. So it was like really cool to see how he took that spin and went another way. But anyway, so for me, lots of film.
Hey, this is Lori. I use case studies in 2 different classes. In the breakout later, I'll be talking about how I use some fiction to teach a course on empathy and difficult conversations. But I think of wider interest is my use of cases in our introductory public administration course. It's really a theory course. And I do not use a textbook. Each week we deal with a different topic, such as accountability, public interest, responsiveness, ethics, the different roles of the public administrator. And to address each of those topics, I use the three frameworks from Den Hart and Den Hart, what they call old public administration, which I call the classical model, new public management, and new public service. And so I use short case studies each week that present a problem for students to solve. And in solving that problem, they need to apply those three frameworks to the specific topic. So it's really a way to get the students to use theory as lenses to see that depending on which framework they use, they define the problem differently and come up with a different set of solutions. So it's really to bring theory to life so that students can use it in problem solving. I tend to find my cases, right from the headlines in the news. There are a lot of good ones right now on election administration. And I try to keep mine very, very short. I try to keep my case studies to two to 3 pages. Students solve them in groups, and they also have to write group papers around them.
All right. So in terms of, I teach kind of a range of classes, undergraduate to PhD, but I'm going to focus a little bit in this answer on an undergraduate intro to public administration class that's designed for political science majors. And so I use case studies in that class. And in this past round, I used 7 different case studies throughout a 17-week class. And I tried to focus on a variety of different cases. So there was a simulation, there was a multimedia case, I used a film, and then I also pulled from more traditional teaching cases from places like the Kennedy School, the Program on Negotiations, and electronic hallway, which is now just hallway or something. And I basically I pair the case every other week with reading, so similar to Lori, in how they think about a concept, and before they come to class, they're given a writing prompt to consider how they would respond to the case given the context of whatever we're reading in class. And then in class, we usually break up into small groups. They have an opportunity usually to respond to a different set of questions that gets them to unpack together the content of the case in the context of the class topic, theme, whatever we're talking about that week, a little bit more in depth. And then we spend quite a bit of time just discussing the case as a whole, as a large group, and thinking about broader implications, thinking about how this case is similar to current events, things that are happening in their own lives. And I've found that in a class like this, it's a great jumping off point for students to be able to connect to broader topics more easily than a traditional academic text. So that's how I use them.
This is so great. I am seeing lots of questions pop up, but I also appreciate, and I hope the audience can too, how the breadth of which all of you talk about the different ways that you're using cases and in the different types of classes you're teaching and using cases in. I think that segues really well into our next question, where I'm going to ask all of you. So in many classes that we use case studies, we use it to connect like classroom-based critical thinking to what we might say like the real world, using the case study as an example of what happens in the real world. And so we can apply frameworks or theories, like Lori mentioned, using those case studies, and our students can do that. So curious panelists, in what ways do you find that case studies help students connect what they learn in the classroom to the real world? And I love the examples. I know the audience is really looking for specific examples. So if you have an example that you could share related to that, I think that would be helpful too.
So I'll give one example, and it's a super dated case, but I absolutely love it. And my students Every time I teach with this case, I get very positive feedback. So there's a simulation case that was originally came out of the Kennedy School, the Harvard case program, whatever it's called. I'm not good with the traditional names, and it focuses on the Columbia disaster. And the simulation gives students only the information that each individual had during the course of a week leading up to the disaster. And so it really gives them an opportunity to think about what the memos look like, what the emails look like, what type of information they were getting at different stages. I'm sorry, I'm breaking up. And think about how information asymmetries really shape decision-making and identifying where problem breakdowns occurred. And so that would be one way that a case allows them, and it just happens to be that context, but it can kind of translate to a lot of different contexts for them to see the same case from one vantage point. And then in conversation, it starts to come out what different people knew at different points in the conversation in the class, I think is really powerful. And they really are able to see the different dynamics that come out from that. And as I kind of alluded to last time, I'll just add that one of the benefits for me in the classroom using case studies is that it creates an opportunity that we can talk about something that everyone is talking about one thing, but it creates an opportunity for students to share their own stories, professional and personal, about working in different spaces in a way that I don't get in other classes when I'm not using case studies.
When I teach the seminar in public administration, the intro graduate level course, and I use Don Kettle's Politics of the Administrative Process, and there's a lot of good case studies that the professor has put in that book. When I use that particular class, I'll break the class up into groups of 3. I tell them that they have about a week to work together, however they choose to work together, to pick a case study from that book that they're interested in. And then when they actually present the case study, they have to do a PowerPoint for the class and pull the relevant points out of that case study and then apply it to something that they've either experienced or seen in the news or something that is relevant today. This semester, the students have already done that exercise. They have 2 of the cases presented. One was on social justice, and they, of course, that's very relevant today. Another was on also the Challenger and bringing out administrative points on that. So they, use the published case studies there, but then actually have to be the teacher. This semester in Zoom, if we were in the classroom, they'd be doing it in front of the class.
I can go. So this is actually fun for me because when we're all watching Netflix, especially with the coronavirus or not. But so my students, they're bringing in this content to me. So I'll start talking about film and we'll talk about case studies, but it's really interesting because they bring it in. And in my last Thursday class, I actually had somebody who was doing a presentation on transparency and accountability. And she was like, and I just saw this episode of Criminal Minds. With this anthrax dilemma, and she was explaining it, and she was like, and I was just sitting there considering, is government being accountable and transparent? Should we be telling people or shouldn't we? So that brought the conversation back to COVID and COVID being on campus. And we're at an HBCU, I'm at an HBCU. So, we were talking about, well, what about if the school says that we have to be vaccinated to be here? And a lot of my students were like, nope, because, they know about the Tuskegee experiment and they were like, no, thank you. And, but we got into these really good conversations about government and ethics, which spawn off of, this conversation on transparency and accountability, but they were just so involved in this conversation. And it wasn't me bringing the case in, but somebody else connecting what we were talking about to something they were seeing, and then we tied it back to current events. So, I mean, yeah, sorry.
I can go. I have two examples. One is just a traditional case study. It's a few pages long, and just for full disclosure, I did not write it. It was written by a colleague of mine at George Washington, and it's on the Voting Rights Act. And the case scenario is that a particular county is closing down a voting site that's in a predominantly African-American neighborhood. Yet a private funder has come in and offered to fund the center to keep it open for voting. And it raises all kinds of questions and problems. And I give it to students and I ask them, what should the county elections commissioner do? Should they accept the private funding or not? And the students, again, they have to apply, Den Hardt's old public administration, new public management, new public service, to identify problems, come up with various solutions, and to vet those solutions. So that's one example. Another way I've used kind of a case in a real world way is to use a case as kind of a continuing thread throughout the class. So a case that we revisit each week. And the case that resonates with students for some reason is the problem of rat infestation in Washington, D.C. We have a big rat problem here. And for some reason, they just love that case. I don't know if they can relate to it. They start naming the rats. They get very attached to the rat. And we revisit it each week. So we talk about the rat problem and the issue of accountability. What's the public interest in the rat problem? And so we just revisit that on a continuing basis. Another one that works, by the way, is the movie Jaws. Except at the beginning of my career, I used to be able to just refer to the movie Jaws, and now they look at me with blank stares when I refer to the movie Jaws, and so I actually have to make them watch it. But that's another one where we can talk about Jaws every single week to revisit some of these concepts and topics and frameworks.
I just have a few more thoughts here. I mean, just one really want to underscore how great popular culture is for these examples. I mean, Reno 911 has some really great examples. In YouTube, you can find little clips of episodes that are really great. One of the things I just want to post in the chat here, just to kind of accentuate some things I'm saying is, I think case studies are valuable because one of the questions I always make sure to ask each week in some form, and the assignments in my classes orient around them, is this question of what can you do with the concept? Because I think, we can very easily get into this point where concepts are just words on a page and people say, well, I don't know how this would really help me in my work. So I emphasize that to them that, you can use these concepts and you can use them to do at least 4 things, describe, explain, predict, and prescribe, how something's put together, why something works the way it does, what might happen if, and what's a reasonable example about that. And so if you just go back to the sexual harassment case that I had posted earlier from JPay, if you were to pair that, for instance, with Bowman and Deal's structural frame, you can actually prompt students to say, okay, well, what was it about the structure that might have made reporting difficult? What was it about the politics of the agency that might have made certain factions about was this type of behavior acceptable or not occur? And by showing that and saying how that these concepts that they're reading about in one book can be used to describe, explain, predict, and or prescribe in another instance is so incredibly valuable. And then I think students are better put away to say, hey, I used that in my job last week, which does happen.
This is Lori. I just want to follow up on what Sean said. That I challenge students to create their own cases or to look for their own cases, particularly on the job. And, one student came in once and she said, we were in a conference and, there was some problem that came up and I forget what the exact problem was, But she sat there and mentally started applying these frameworks and coming up with problem definitions and solutions. And she ended up with, 3 different problem definitions and solutions and delivering them in this meeting. And she came running into class and she said, I think I was the smartest person in the room. So I think if we challenge, not just give cases to students, but if we challenge them to find cases or to use their own real life interactions as kind of living cases, they get even more out of them.
These are all such really excellent points about how rich the opportunities are with case studies, right? It's not just something that can happen in the classroom, but that if we can use case studies to like show students the process that we want them to, how do you use these skills when you leave our classroom? And case studies are a great way to not only reinforce what we're learning in class, but how to then take it and apply it someplace else. And so I think, again, this is a great segue into our next question, which is, we've been talking a lot about these critical thinking skills, and those are, without any doubt, really important for our students to have. But I think there's also an additional set of skills that case studies can allow us to develop, and those are related to understanding other people, and specifically some of these values that stem from like storytelling and connecting with the stories of others. So my next question for the panelists, and this is going to be our last question before we open up the floor to the audience, is going to be like, in what ways do you think case studies cultivate interpersonal and like qualitative rationality of current or future public servants?
I think that it makes students realize the personal nature of things. That yes, they can read, about concepts or theories or, practice in a textbook. But when you bring in case studies, and particularly if it's from storytelling or, news, or what Lori was saying about students creating their case studies because of things they've seen, I think it makes the field of public administration more personal and more relevant to help the student understand these other things that we're teaching, such as theory, concepts, etc.
I can go. We think about it in terms of not just what the case is, but how we use it. And so, for example, our cases are done in groups, and over the summer before students come in, we have them take the Myers-Briggs assessment. And so we get their Myers-Briggs types and we put them in groups based on their types, such that each group maximizes the diversity of type. And the idea is that students will need to kind of work and talk across the boundaries of their type and their preferences in order to come to some understanding of the problem. And so, we structure these as group activities, and we are very intentional about the way that we structure groups to try to kind of embed into that, I don't want to say conflict, but some challenges.
I'll add that one of the things that I like about using case studies is that it also creates an opportunity or a model for deep and engaged listening, so that students have the opportunity to listen carefully to others' perspectives on a topic that might not be as immediately personal as other conversations that come up are. So I think it creates opportunities in my classroom, at least, to start in a place where everyone is talking about something else, to listen to what people are saying, to be thoughtful about that process of listening, to practice listening. We even talk about engaged listening before we go into groups, and then have opportunities for jumping off points for conversations that are, as I previously mentioned, and as others have mentioned, how those cases then are relevant to current events or things that are, for example, things that are happening on campus, which is where the conversation in undergraduate class often goes.
I'll just jump in here really quickly. So I'm going to post some stuff in the chat, but also I see, if I may, I also see that Seth Meyer is in the room, and he and Richard Gregory Johnson are editing a book on case studies with a social equity focus. And I believe I think there's an online submission form for it. So I don't know if it's acceptable to post that, but looks fantastic. But I just want to post something in here, and I think, with respect to the question that you asked about these interpersonal and qualitative rationality, it's to really emphasize how people are not just thinking beings, but they're also feeling beings, and they're social beings, and all of these different dynamics come in together. So these are just some examples of questions that I asked to try to get to those elements that you're referring to. Is like asking students, have you seen or experienced something similar? And I always qualify that by saying, only share if you feel comfortable doing it. And people invariably say, well, something similar happened to me, or something similar happened to someone else, and here is what I thought, and here is what I felt. And it brings that human element that sometimes we wash out in our discussions at PA, but we absolutely need to be there. How would you have responded, and why? Why did something happen the way that it did? And I think this is one of the more powerful types of questions that we can ask, because it allows us, again, to go back to a previous question, to use our concepts. Like, let's just say you want to use bounded rationality. Well, how did bounded rationality, what power does it have to explain the Challenger disaster, the Columbia disaster, or the sexual harassment example? But also, challenging them to say, well, if you understand these theories of how people make decisions, how might this help you in your own work? And again, just go back to Bowman and Deal. If workplaces are combinations of coalitions and alliances and shifting power dynamics and fights and so forth like that, understanding these things, how might you be able to go back into your work environment and promote understanding when there are such factions there, as it might be? So it looks like Seth posted some information there, so I encourage everyone to check that out. But again, finding ways to bring the whole person there, especially their feelings and their emotions.
And I could jump off real quick. So I think what using film is that you get to see the other person, right? So it allows for that conversation and around those difficult topics. So like, and I've lived in different places. So I grew up in the Caribbean, but I lived in Florida, Nebraska, California, and now Deep South. And like, I think each place you have different cultures and different norms and everything. And it'll be interesting that when we look at one case, people have different reactions to it and how, things are being portrayed or the decisions that are made. But for me, film gives you that opportunity to really talk about it. So when I was in California, we had a lot of strong feelings against Border Patrol. I was at an HSI, so a lot of people were like, Border Patrol are really bad. And then we talked, well, let's talk about Nazi Germany, and we can play a clip from that where it takes it away from Border Patrol. And it's like, well, how does public administration play into this? Do you serve, the public, or do you serve the administration? And we get into these conversations, and then we bring it back into like the Border Patrol. And it's like this understanding, are you really expecting them to not have their jobs, when they have families to feed, and getting into that conversation. So there's this kind of like learning, and it's different perspectives. So just, for me, I just think it's like this really good thing that when you have these populations that might be, not consider other perspectives, then we're giving them this outlet. We might watch Empire and learn about hip hop, which is something we didn't learn. And, so there's just tons of ways that we could just use film to like really understand populations that we might not understand, or consider, and understand why their viewpoints are different. So.
If I could just give a shout out here to Lori Brain, if I may. Lori Brain, sorry, Lori, putting you on the spot right there, but Lori has a really interesting piece that was just published in Public Integrity about using narrative fiction in the course. So I encourage everyone to check that. It hasn't been assigned a volume or issue number yet, but I believe it's in the most recently published. So check it out. It's really good.
This is Lori. I'm happy to send it to anybody who would like it. But thank you, Sean, because I was actually going to follow up and say that for me, in terms of interpersonal and cultural competency, novels work best, at least for me. And maybe it's just because I like to read. But scientific studies do show that reading a particular kind of fiction, literary fiction, does actually expand the part of the brain that deals with empathy and consideration for others. And so it's a way of kind of stretching the students' empathy without sort of teaching them empathy, which I worry they might find a little bit patronizing. But the response to using novels has been incredibly positive. I was concerned about using them. Our students come and they want to learn statistics and they want to learn budgeting and they want to learn management, and then they show up and they get a class where they're going to read novels. And I've just worried that it would be a little bit of a letdown for them, but they really appreciate the different kind of class that it is, but they also embrace the idea of finally having conversations about really touchy, difficult, sensitive, uncomfortable topics. And we use the novels as both a way into those conversations, but it's also kind of a safe space to retreat. If the conversations become too tense, we can kind of return back to talking about the characters in the novel.
I want to add on to that, and I thank you, Lori, for sharing about your work in that area, because I think it's really valuable. We're getting a lot of, I've been watching the chat box and the questions around, case studies on emerging countries or nonprofits and things like that. Sometimes the comments are 100% right. It's hard to find those if you're limiting yourself to some of these, quote, like more traditional outlets of like peer-reviewed journal articles. Like maybe it is hard to find it there, but there is an innumerable additional amount of resources available if you consider literary fiction, or if you consider films or television shows. And so if we can think creatively about how we can also use those in the classroom, it really does open up more opportunities. And then to Sean's point about, trying to get those stories those case studies into these publication outlets, there are opportunities for us to keep working on that front too. And so I think that this conversation is really, really insightful and really helpful. I don't know if any of the other panelists wanted to add on to that question. But I have seen, I don't know if there's anybody in the audience, if you want to turn your camera on or send me a note saying that you would like to ask a question to the panelists. We have about the next 10 minutes, we're going to open the floor up for Q&A from the audience. There's one question that we haven't directly addressed that I saw Elizabeth Nesbitt posted earlier about public policy or policy evaluation. I wonder if any of the panelists have any experience with case study related specifically like in that area that they could share, either using any of these outlets or types of media that we've discussed. Well, I will jump in. Maybe it's not public policy, but it is related to policy and having organizational policy discussions. Sean, the case study that he mentioned, that he linked to much earlier in the chat about the sexual harassment, I use that in my org theory class to talk about different policies and how, an organization can draft the policy, but if there's the organizational culture becomes a big part of implementing different policy. And so I know that that's not necessarily the public policy context, but here's Elizabeth. Elizabeth, I don't know if you want to ask your question to all of us. We'd love to hear from you.
That was the question pretty much. I just have trouble finding good case studies for public policy, and I tend to use them most, first to understand how policy is made. And since I have students, I like to have students practice writing and noticing how you write about public policy. And even there, it's hard to find little snippets so they can kind of get the language. But I also just look for examples that help me to introduce the idea of policy analysis, to give them just a little nugget they can use to get at the ideas of stakeholders and policy alternatives and defining a problem.
Can I just interject really quickly? Okay, I mean, I was trying to find the questions. That's why I was looking there. But I think one of the best cases that I've used when it comes to something like that is actually the creation of I-70 in Denver, Colorado, because that implicates so many issues of policymakers further marginalizing historically marginalized populations. There are issues that are of racism that are implicated. There are issues of white supremacy, patriarchy to a degree, and then having students explore that case in terms of how administrators, but then also elected leaders are exacerbating existing inequities through the creation of the highway and the different argumentation about the benefits and the cons to these communities when these communities are not really consulted in any sort of meaningful way was really, really powerful. And I think that also allows, when I teach public policy, which has been a few years now, but I still use this case in other ways, it allows the students to explore, especially if you're going into like policy analysis class and cost benefit analysis and both quantitative and qualitative approaches to policy analysis to really indicate what are the pros and cons and what are alternatives that also better factor in equity in ways that traditional cost benefit analysis do not. I-70 is a, when I say it's a great case, it's a sobering case, but yeah.
Right, thank you.
So my roots in urban politics might come out a little bit, but similarly, I use a case from Syracuse Park on the decision. It's more, I focus more on the participatory elements of whose voices are heard, who the stakeholders are in making the decision around highway development or redevelopment in Syracuse. So not unlike the I-70 case.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is Stephanie talking. Thank you so much for these recommendations. I know, Elizabeth, I hope that you found this helpful, and I hope that we can explore some more in the breakout room shortly. I see Brenda has joined us and she would like to ask a question, I think, of the panelists too. You want to go ahead, Brenda? We can't hear you. If you would like to unmute.
Sorry, I think I'd
Perfect.
have that down by now. I am really interested in one of the breakout rooms about developing your own case study. In my organizational change class this semester, I use the Bowman and Deal book, but I'm also using my own research, which I published in a book. It's a longitudinal case study. And so we're sort of reading it parallel to the main text. And what we're sort of doing is turning this longitudinal case study into a book club sort of format. And so I'm really curious as to how people have turned their own research into cases that they're using in class. And I know some folks have talked about that, but this is giving me some ideas, but that's just a general interest. Thanks, everybody.
Any comments from the panelists? Okay, great. Del, take it away.
Yeah, no. So, I mean, I'm film, so I watch film and I write about it, which is like a really easy connection, but it justifies my, Netflix binging when I have a dissertation to write. But it is that, right? Like, I'm one of those people that I watch something and I'm like, I see the public administration and it's like, I see those concepts and I want to make sure, and I just want to talk about it. And connect it. I've seen Star Wars and I haven't found any connections. I'm sure other people can. I'm not a big Star Wars fan, but if you can, it'll be a good one to write on. So I wrote about the Avengers and coming from that nonprofit focus, thinking about the Avengers as as a non-governmental organization providing government services and what's the ethics around that. So for me, it was like an easy research path to see something, make the connection, and then take the time to write it up. And then, it's still something fun and enjoyable. I know Seth Meyer's on here and he just did one of the Good Plays. He beat me to it because I really wanted to do that one too. But maybe later on. So, it's for me, it's what I'm doing. I'm watching Netflix. So I might as well write on it.
Yeah, so I'm Pallavi. And I recently finished my PhD from Florida International University. So my question actually is that during my dissertation data collection, I had a lot of qualitative data which came from my local government research. So many of those, during the data collection, a lot of themes emerged, which can be really converted into case studies. So right now I'm thinking of developing that as a book on local government management, case studies in local government management. So there are around like 8 case studies which has emerged from my data. So I was really interested, like wanting to know that is there a way to fund, like if there is any follow-up required to build on some of the data which I already have, to develop it into cases and again go back to those agencies and do my interview. So there was some kind of a funding I was looking at. So it's like, is there like a place where I can look for that kind of a project? Which is a little, say, like a transitional question, I'm sure, but since you're all into this field, maybe you'd be you would have some understanding of where to look for those kind of resources.
Ashley, you want to
So I can
just interject real quick. This will be our last question, and then we'll go into our breakout room. So Ashley.
Okay.
Oh, I don't know if I should be the one that responds then. So I don't know that I don't have a real good response in terms of identifying funding sources to help kind of move in that direction. I can say that I have long dreamed about writing my own case based on all of my research and have dabbled in drafts. And so I too have like a, you know, like a stack of draft cases that haven't gone anywhere. For me, I've thought about kind of more submitting them, less about the funding for kind of the next stage, but submitting them for competitions, right? So through Syracuse or something like that, that would help offset the investment that I made with hopes of potentially winning an award. But I don't know that that really doesn't answer your question.
Yeah.
I think it's a really important question about funding research projects. There's both many opportunities to apply for different grants, and then it feels like there's almost no opportunities that might fit your specific research goal or questions that you have. I would certainly be happy to chat with you afterwards, because I've used a couple different data points from my dissertation to turn into publications that are case studies. And so I don't have a lot of success in getting that type of research funded, but I'd be certainly happy to talk with you about the steps that I took to do that if that would be useful. But I think it's a great question.
I mean, because you really don't want to waste that kind of data, which is so much very useful on different topics which are emerging and of a real concern for the educational community. And unfortunately for case study development, we do not have enough cases in the public sector domain, and neither we have spaces or kind of people or foundations or places where you really can get funding for these kind of projects. So so I'm very grateful for your
please, I really would be happy to connect with you and share what I've done. So thank you so much for the question. The next part of this workshop, we're going to go into some breakout rooms. So I'm going to open these breakout rooms. Everyone should get the option to go into a breakout room using the 3 different rooms that we have. Let me make sure you all are finding ways to get into these different rooms. So did it open up for everybody? I'm seeing the panel. No. Yes. No. Sean, can you remind the audience where they can find that, because it looks different on my screen than on your screen?
Sure. So what everyone does, if you could look to the bottom of your Zoom screen, there should be something about divide into groups. It looks like 4 squares, all forming a bigger square. If you click on that, a new window should open up, and you should have the 3 different rooms. And if you hover your mouse over the number that's on the far right-hand side, you should have the option to join a particular room.
Some people are saying that they can't seem to find it.
I don't have that option. I don't either.
Yeah.
It depends on which device you're using. Different devices handle Zoom differently and provide different options. I'm using a Mac and I do not have it on my screen.
Okay. Let me try this a different way. So I'm going to close these rooms, and we're going to do this one other way. So what we're going to do, I had hoped that you all would be able to go into that you would get to choose your own rooms, but I'm going to divide you into automatically into a room. And if the moderators are going to have to check to make sure that you go into the right room. And if you want to visit a different room, you should have the option to leave that room, and then you'll be able to choose a different room after that, or I'll remain in this room and I can assign you to a room. So let's do it this way. Okay. Right. So everyone should be joining us here shortly. Oh, it's so nice to see faces. It's so great to see so many people here. I trust that you all had a good meeting in your breakout rooms. I just want to thank all of you sincerely for your patience going in and out of these breakout rooms and the breaking out into the breakout room. So I did have a request from one of the individuals in our group that if you had PowerPoint or a handout that you shared in your breakout room, I would love to put those in Pathable so everybody can have access to those later. So any resources you share, I would really love to have those. So to wrap us up, first I want to open the floor to Stacy from NASPA. She has a short message for us, and then about case studies in NASPA. So Stacy, would you like to share some things with us?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I'm really happy to be able to talk with you all today.
Are other people able to hear Stacy? No?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Great. I just wanted to let you know, as many of you are hopefully aware, NASPA has our new Institute of Innovative Teaching and Learning for Public Service, part of which case studies, simulations are going to be a major component of this new institute. We are currently working on developing a platform that will house case studies and simulations and be a resource for programs. And we're also very interested in the creation of case studies that will be a part of this new platform to make sure that we have up-to-date cases that can be used in the classroom, because we're very excited to have our programs use experiential learning as a tool moving forward, or continuing to use that as a tool for students. And so I just want to make sure that you're aware. I put some links in the chat earlier, but I'll make sure that they're in the materials that go out. That NASPA is putting together resources. We're working with ICMA on some local government case studies. We've had one case study writing competition that we had last year. We're envisioning having more as we get some more traction with the new institute. And we're hoping that the platform will be able to go live sometime in the next, hopefully by January, but we'll see. Things have been slowed down a little bit due to COVID. But just want to make sure that you're all aware of that and keep an eye out for information that comes out regarding the Institute in the future. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That's so exciting. I do want to hear from everybody that on the panel about how the breakout rooms went, and if there's one or two summaries or takeaways that you want to share with everybody before we wrap things up. So let's start with room number 1. I don't know if Del or Lori want to share.
I'm laughing because I had no idea what room number I was in.
Oh.
A few things stand out to me. One was that we all want to know how to find resources for cases and for films and for novels and for all the TV shows and all the different things we use. And Del brought up IMDb for films. I mentioned Goodreads for novels. I'm on Goodreads if anyone wants to follow me. The spoiler alert is you'll also be treated to the junk I read as well. Actually, I took some notes, so let me just look for them. Oh, and another thing that stood out to me was a lot of our questions related to the unknowables. So there's so much that we don't know in advance, right? So we can structure our cases and we can figure out what we want students to learn and we can have rubrics, but there is still so much that could happen in the course of talking about a case in class. And anything can and does come up. And so we need to think about how to respond to those. And we're all a little bit anxious about how to respond to some things that could come up. Dell?
No, I think it was good. It was really a good conversation, and I love that everybody was sharing, because there is a lot of people that are using it in different contexts and different classes, like public budgeting, and so it's just good that people are using it, and we're thinking of how to be more intentional, and that there is interest in finding these alternative ways to like connect to our students. So I just hope it continues, and I just love to see where this is going to go.
Same. Man, I want to take a public budgeting class that is using case studies. I think that sounds so exciting. So I want to, oh, Lori, go ahead.
But I say one more thing, and
Absolutely.
I'm going to beat this drum that I beat a lot. But another question that came up was the question of, how do you develop an interest in these different kinds of things? And what are the risks, especially for junior faculty, of having unconventional teaching methods? And so I just want to make a plug, especially for senior people on this call and in other dimensions of our professional life, that we need to make room for cases and unconventional teaching methods. One of the things that has always frustrated me is that if I were to publish a case, I wouldn't really get credit for it. It wouldn't really count towards anything. And junior people, especially, who often have like the greatest ideas, are the ones most at risk, right, for not getting tenure. And so I think that if we could make a space in our profession, and NASPA could maybe do this, for a way to give more credit in professional terms for writing cases and publishing them, I think that would be a great incentive for people to do it.
Sing it, Lori.
I will
totally.
When we see a lot of,
I want to remind people of that special issue.
Yeah, because I just wanted to add to the point what you just said, is that there are a lot of traditionally the case studies we always will refer to the Harvard Business Review reserves. I mean, of course, there are more business oriented cases, and of course, Richard Ivey is another traditional resource in the business management space, but they are like really exemplary cases. So I'm just kind of curious to understand that who are these faculty members who are at Harvard or these schools who are really preparing these kind of exemplary cases along with the teaching notes and all. And I have also recently figured out something called as Bloomberg Harvard City Leadership Initiative. So they have also kind of developed a lot of case studies which are city centric, city management centric, and that really comes with teaching note and kind of graphics and videos as a supporting material to teach. And these are all faculty members who are developing it. So I was just kind of trying to understand that why, I mean, in our space as public affairs and public administration scholars and educators, we are not having that kind of a space to be able to having that kind of a quality case writing, and that also is counted into your tenure process, because at the end of the day it's really important to be able to good educators as well, rather than just writing research articles and those kinds of things. So that's something is a really an important conversation which really needs to happen in our space of public affairs education. Yeah,
I didn't agree more. And thank you, Lori, for bringing this up, and Palavia for reinforcing those ideas. We definitely have to ask the questions of, if only certain people even have the space to create these case studies, what kind of cases are being left out. And that's why in this workshop, we really wanted to not just talk about published case studies, but all these different ways we can find content, because we need all the diversity of voices and perspectives in order to teach our students the skills we want them to have. And so I wanted to make a quick note before. I want to hear from the second breakout group on opportunities for finding case studies in published outlets. But I am going to be updating the resources tab in Pathable with I'm going to comb through our discussion chat for all the different options people shared. I'm going to put that into one place for all of us to be able to access later. So do check back in that space for some of the tools and suggestions people have. I'm going to try to synthesize that a little more easily for everybody. So from Sean and Ashley, tell us if you could share quickly about your breakout room.
John, are you going to stay silent until I chime in?
Yeah, I was waiting for you.
So we had a good conversation around all the different ways that we can find cases, and kind of thinking beyond, right? So I tend to draw on traditional cases from the Kennedy Rule or the Evans hallway, but thinking beyond all the different ways that we talk, newspaper articles, and then we also talk about specifically how we, like, what we look for in a case. So if we're looking for an already published case, what is it that we're looking for from, and then how we can then, like, the different tools or analytic strategies that we can use to analyze those cases. Anything you want to add to that, Sean?
No, that was great. Great group.
Great, thank you so much. And I will turn it over to my co-breakout room facilitator, Patricia. Do you want to share about our conversation in the third breakout room on creating your own case studies for use in the classroom?
Yes, we had some good conversation, and a couple of things that struck me as individuals talked and everyone shared with us. We had a group, I guess, of 8 in there. What I would define as the richness of the way that they're being used, depending on what course they're teaching, and the students before them. We heard about various ways that cases are being used and what they try to pull out of them. But then there was also an excellent question on, if you teach a specific case study, then how do you make that generalizable to others, or so that the student is left with not just an answer for a specific situation, but how can they translate that into thinking about the facts of that case, but also how it will affect something else that they may run into in their public sector career. And we had some really good conversation around that. So good discussion.
Yeah, and I just want to add on to that, that it's one thing I love about NASPA, especially the opportunity to do this virtually, is we had people from several different parts of the world in our group. And so, I just want to, I guess, end today by thanking all of our attendees who are here today. I know we all have many different things we could do with our time, but the fact that you all chose to spend some time with us is really meaningful to me. And so I would love to end with, if anybody who's still left, if you want to turn your camera on, I would love to see you and say goodbye. I want to thank the panelists again. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your time, panelists, and thank you everybody else for your time too. I hope you enjoy the rest of your time at NASPA, and check back Pathable to see the different resources we'll put up there.
And thank you to Stephanie, who put this together and did all the coordinating, and it was just wonderful. So thank you, Stephanie.
Agreed. So thank you all for being with us.
Thank you for joining us. All right.
Thank you, Stephanie. It was really great to be a part of the session.
Thank you for being here. Really appreciate it.
Bye.